Now, folks, today, this class is going to be easier than last week. I'm sorry that I had to lay so much on you last week from that very, very complicated sugya, the passage from the Babylonian Talmud. But I think it was an important final chapter in the Talmud to review so that we could see the issues that are still being debated in the Talmudic era about the extent and the scope of the Bible's ban on intermarriage, and how the rabbis of the Talmud saw the progression of the ban on intermarriage, such that they didn't see, or in some cases, rabbis did not see that ban originating in the Torah completely, but sort of growing from an initial reluctance in the Torah to forbid marriage with maybe those from particular nations, growing from era to era into a full-blown prohibition, getting stricter and stricter and stricter until we come to a general prohibition against intermarriage and even against intimacy with Gentiles by the time we get to the passage that we reviewed last week. Like I said, this week, the sources are much, much smaller, trust me, much easier to consume. But just before we jump into it, a reminder. I don't know if there's any new faces here, but if there are, or if we just have lousy memories like I do, I think it helps to always do chazara, to always do review of where we've been. What we have seen so far in the biblical and Talmudic passages, I don't think there's any way of getting around it, is a very strong, almost unambiguous, it seems, promotion of Jewish endogamy. You can't make the argument that from the beginning, the Torah was not concerned with Jews and who they marry. So a strong promotion of Jewish endogamy, number one. Number two, an opposition to intermarriage and even interintimacy, if we could invent such a word, that becomes compounded by the rabbinic embrace of conversion. So let me be clear about that. I think that's really important for understanding rabbinic Judaism. And it's almost counterintuitive that because the rabbis embraced embraced conversion so strongly, which we should not take for granted. There were other versions of Judaism in the Second Temple that did not permit conversion. But because rabbinic Judaism embraced conversion, it made the opposition to intermarriage even more forceful. Because obviously, you can just say to a person, well, if you want to marry a Jew, here's the way to do it. There's a pathway you have to follow. You can't just get married. We've created a pathway so that you can become a member of the covenanted people. And once you become a member of that covenantal people, then we'll permit your marriage. And that's very important because, folks, we are not talking about a Judaism that rejects a person because of who they are, where they come from. That is not rabbinic Judaism. We're not rejecting the person, the non-Jewish person. What we're doing is insisting that there be that process of conversion to become part of the Jewish people. So we're going to just look at two sources that we've already seen, one that we've already seen and one that sort of summarizes what we might think we've seen, to refresh our memories about what might seem to be, I'm saying that to keep you interested, what might seem to be a clear biblical prohibition against intermarriage. Deuteronomy 7 is the famous Lo titchatein bam. Do you see this on the screen? Okay. Rose, could you read for me this passage from Deuteronomy 7? We've seen it before, And this is the passage from the Torah that warns very clearly against marrying
Okay.
outside.
When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them.
You can I'll underline that line, right? Velo titchatein bam. Do not intermarry with them.
Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn inside you and will quickly destroy you.
Good. Thank you, Rose. So you see in Deuteronomy the concern for Jewish distinctiveness once the people enter the land. You have to stay separate. And the Torah follows up this ban against intermarriage by giving an explanation. What's the problem? They'll turn your children away to serve other gods. And remember, we talked about whether that was the first order concern or the second order concern. Does that mean that if they don't turn your children away, that it's okay to intermarry with them? We will get there. But it seems rather clear from this passage in Deuteronomy that the Torah's concern for Jewish distinctiveness is very, very, very important. Now we jump ahead to the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, for those of you who have not seen the Shulchan Aruch before, it's a very, very important source because the Shulchan Aruch is almost a final code of Jewish law. If you're looking for quick and clear resolutions to questions of Jewish practice, quick and clear, you turn to the Shulchan Aruch. That is, you don't want to know minority opinions or who argued with who. You just want to know what the law is. You turn to the Shulchan Aruch. And if you've studied the Shulchan Aruch before, you know that part of the reason that it is authoritative is because it includes both a Sephardic portion and an Ashkenazi commentary, so that Jews, no matter what their tradition is, whether Ashkenazi or Sephardi, can find the practice that they follow within its chapters. So let me ask, here's another passage, and I'm offering this sort of as, if you want to know the summary of what we've learned, it seems we may have been learning so far, the Shulchan Aruch might be that passage. Naomi, could I ask you to read? Thank you so much.
If a Jew has intercourse, hold on. Okay. If a Jew has intercourse with a Gentile in the context of marriage, he has violated a biblical prohibition. As it says, you shall not marry them.
Where's that? You shall not marry them. Rose just read that. Velo titchatein bam. So the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Joseph Caro in the 15th century, he says, what does that mean, velo titchatein bam? It means Jews may not have intercourse. It does not say an idolater. It says a Gentile. You cannot have intercourse with a Gentile, derech ishut, in the context of marriage. Okay, so it's the Torah's ban of marriage between Jews and non-Jews, which according to the Shulchan Aruch originates in the Torah. Now, folks, let us not take that for granted. Remember, one of the big questions we've been asking ourselves from the beginning is, what is the biblical prohibition? What is the eternal ruling of the Torah, which ought to fit all times and all circumstances, versus what is the rabbinic additional layers of laws which relate to intermarriage, which may have been added over the centuries, designed to fit Not every circumstance, but particular times and particular circumstances. So according to this passage in the Shulchan Aruch, it is part of the ruling of the Torah that Jews may not marry non-Jews, period. It is a biblical prohibition. Okay, that would be almost close the case. If this were it, we could just end the class now and say, there's nothing else to say, right? And many of you may have thought that that's what the ruling is. If all you have in front of you is a Shulchan Aruch, you say, the matter is closed. The Torah says no intermarriage with anybody, period. Right? But keep going.
But if one has intercourse with a Gentile outside the context of marriage, then this is a rabbinic violation.
In other words, he cannot find any line in the Torah or anything in the Torah that would suggest that intercourse with a Gentile outside of marriage is a biblical prohibition. That he cannot find. So he says this is something that was added later on in the rabbinic tradition. Now that is important, remember folks, because last week we saw from the book of Jubilees a interpretation that connected Molech worship. Do not give your daughters over to Molech worship, which is a verse that is found in the middle of the book of Leviticus in the Torah. In the book of Jubilees says that means you can't have sex with the non-Jew. So for the book of Jubilees, it is a biblical prohibition, not for the Shulchan Aruch. For the Shulchan Aruch, intercourse outside the context of marriage is a lesser degree sin. It's still a sin, but it's not a biblical level sin. It's only prohibited on a rabbinic level. Okay, keep going.
One who has intercourse with a Gentile woman, if he was not struck down by zealots, nor beaten by the court, then his sin is explicit in the prophetic tradition as Karaite.
Correct.
No.
Okay, very good. So where did we see this? Struck down by zealots or beaten by the court? Let's go back to last week. Here, what I'm showing you on my screen is last week's sources. And if you remember, I got to find it. But there's a passage in the Mishnah that says, Hagonev, one who has intercourse with an Aramean woman is killed by zealots. Kanaim pogim bo. It's almost a descriptive passage in the Mishnah. If we find you having intercourse with a non-Jew, don't read Aramean, by the way, as Aramean. It's a general word the rabbis use to describe non-Jew. If you're found having intercourse with an Aramean woman, you get killed by zealots. It doesn't say who kills you. Like, it doesn't say that it has to come from an order of the court. It might be saying, someone is entitled to see you. But remember, someone is entitled to kill you if they see you. But remember, I related this to the story of Pinchas and Zimri. This is from a story in the Torah where Pinchas sees Zimri having sex with a Midianite woman in public. And what does he do? Takes the spear, and that's the end of him. So the Torah seems to permit killing somebody if they're found to be having sex with a non-Jew, and therefore we get this passage in the Mishnah that says, and if you see somebody doing that, you're also permitted to drive a spear through them. Now, we don't have any evidence that this actually ever took place, and there's almost here in the Shulchan Aruch a little hint that it didn't take place, because it says if he was not struck down by zealots or not beaten by the court, then his sin is explicit in the prophetic tradition, which means karet. Karet is excision. He gets cut off from the people, and that's what happens if we find out that you did this, because you violated not a biblical prohibition, but a rabbinic prohibition. Now, where it says note, this is the Ashkenazi commentary. So what is noted by Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who wrote the Ashkenazi commentary? Go ahead, Naomi.
No. A Jewish man who has intercourse with a Gentile woman in public where the rule is that zealots strike him down. This is in the category of forbidden sexual relationships, about which we say that one must murder oneself rather than violate it, as is the case with all the other sexual prohibitions.
What is he talking about here? This is very, very serious. Rabbi Moshe Isserles says, yeah, okay, he gets cut off, he gets excised, but there's more to say about this man who is found having intercourse with a Gentile woman. Now, by the way, he adds this word in public, which was not found in 2 lines above. It just says one who has intercourse with a Gentile woman. But in the Ashkenazi commentary, he makes sure to say, hey, you don't just go around into looking at who's in which hotel room, and if you see somebody, you shoot them. No. This is a person who is asked to do this in public, or somehow gets involved in a sexual relationship with a non-Jew in public. You should know that that is in the category of Yehareg ve'al ya'avor. In Judaism, there are certain sins that are called Yehareg ve'al ya'avor. You should be killed. Rather you be killed, let's say it that way, than transgress them. Rather you should be killed than transgress them. Or you might put this in the category of self-sacrifice. Let yourself be killed rather than violate the prohibition. Other people might refer to these as the 3 exceptional sins. The 3 exceptional sins. Why? Actually, Rabbi Cutler and I got into an interesting argument about it. Rabbi Cutler is the rabbi of Adath Israel, for those of you who don't know him. So some of what you've seen with regard to the pandemic is Jews promoting, and rabbis especially, promoting the principle of the sacredness of Jewish life, what is called pikuach nefesh. Have some of you heard that word before? Yeah. Pikuach nefesh, right? Pikuach, save your life. All other rules get pushed aside when pikuach nefesh, the saving of a life, comes first. And Rabbi Cutler, who's very attentive to this stuff, he says, that's not true. A lot of rabbis are saying it, but that is inaccurate. In Judaism, there are 3 things which are more important than pikuach nefesh. And he's absolutely right. We just don't say this because it wouldn't make us look very good, right? And during a pandemic to tell people, well, you actually should get COVID if you're in the following 3 circumstances. We're not, part of this is giving out a message, not teaching people the intricacies of Jewish law in the middle of a pandemic. So you'll see from me and from others, pikuach nefesh, but the truth is there are 3 rules in Judaism that there are 3 prohibitions in Judaism that one must not violate, even if it costs you your life. These are sort of like some fundamental things you should know about Judaism. If you're nerdy like me about Judaism, you want to know certain rules, this is a good thing to know. What are the 3? The 3 are idolatry. If somebody says, you need to go and bow down to that idol in the middle of Dundas Square, and you'll be filmed doing it, you say no. But I'll give you COVID if you don't do it. So give me COVID, right? That's number 1. Number 2, you need to murder somebody. Go kill that person. And if you don't, I'll kill you. You're supposed to say, kill me. I'm not going to sacrifice his life or her life to save my life. That's number 2. And what is number 3? Now let's go back to the source. He gave it away. Arayot. Let me highlight it for you. Hu bichlal arayot. Do you see where I'm pointing? Hu bichlal arayot. These are the sexual prohibitions. Vedino lehareg velo ya'avor. This is part of the sexual prohibitions. Rather you should be killed than violate it. So if somebody says, go to the middle of Dundas Square, you, Jewish person, and have sex with a non-Jew, you say, no, even if you kill me, I won't do it. Kmo bishar arayot, which is the ruling which applies to all other prohibitions, sexual prohibitions in the Torah, right? Which includes, by the way, incest and adultery and bestiality, all that fun stuff. You are not allowed to do, even if it costs you your own life. Yehareg ve'al ya'avor. Now, if all I had, folks, was the Shulchan Aruch, and I was figuring out what does Judaism have to teach about sex with non-Jews, the matter, based on what we've read in the Torah, based on what's written here in the Shulchan Aruch, seems to be rather unambiguous. You are not allowed. It is a very serious prohibition. But I have more to teach you. You can see I've got a whole bunch of pages here to teach you. So why don't I just end the class now? So some of you who have studied with me before know that I do like to teach in a way where we're not only learning about a particular theme, but we're also learning about how Jewish law works. And what I'd like to do this class is just give you a little bit of an introduction, and more next class, on how dangerous it is to understand, or the word in Hebrew is paskin, that is legislate, to understand or paskin Jewish law by opening up one source in the Shulchan Aruch and saying, this is the rule, go home, that's it. We miss all of the dissenting voices, all of the historical evolution, all of the arguments that took place in this case for 1,000 years on this subject, because we're simply relegating ourselves to abiding by the ruling of one text, which I understand is an important text. I understand the Shulchan Aruch is important. But one can still remain, in my opinion, within the boundaries of normative Judaism and look at what the dissenting opinions might have been that the Shulchan Aruch itself chose to discount and not to mention. That's what I'd like us to look at now. And by looking at it, I'm giving you all a general ruling that surface readings of texts in this religion are never, ever sufficient. If surface readings of texts were sufficient, women would not be permitted to learn Talmud, because that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. We would never know that there were dissenting voices actually throughout Jewish history that says it would be permitted for women to learn. But surface readings are never sufficient. If surface readings were sufficient, remember what I said last week? We wouldn't be allowed to drink water from a glass that was uncovered, because a snake may have poisoned it. That's the ruling in the Shulchan Aruch. But surface readings are not sufficient. We would never have learned that there were rabbis who said that if you're living in a place with no poisonous snakes, you don't have to be worried about a poisonous snake getting into your water, and you're allowed to drink water from a glass that was uncovered. We always have to ask why. We always have to delve deeper. We always need to see how the law evolves and gets us to the point where things seemingly might be very clear. So as we go further, I want to remind you of the ambiguities that we've already seen. The ambiguities that ask, well, what is rabbinic and what is biblical? And the second ambiguity, what is the first order concern? What is the second order concern? Is this all about idolatry? Or is this about ethnic preservation? Or let's not use the word ethnic preservation because conversion is allowed. Let's just call it boundaries, ideological boundaries, delineating and fortifying ideological boundaries. That's why I teach this. It's not just to show you about intermarriage, but that the beauty of Jewish law, the wonder of Jewish law, requires us listening to multiple voices. Those who just look at the Shulchan Aruch and say, this is the law, there's nothing we can do about it, they're missing everything. So let's look first at this category of biblical versus non-biblical, which I referred to when Naomi was reading the section from the Shulchan Aruch that clearly puts the words lo titchaten bam, which are found in the Torah, which clearly understands those words as prohibiting all marriages with all non-Jews as a biblical, right, as a biblical prohibition. Let's read here from Midrash Tanaim Dvarim, which tells you sort of how we get there. How do we understand this to be a biblical prohibition? When the first passage we read today from the book of Deuteronomy seems to say that it's only about 7 nations. So how is it so clear to the Shulchan Aruch that actually it doesn't apply to just 7 nations, it applies to everybody? Marcia, would you help us read Midrash Tanaim? Speak to the children of Israel.
Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if any man hands of his seed to Molech, he shall surely die. Rabbi Ishmael says, this refers to one who has intercourse with an Aramean woman and thereby raises up from her an enemy of God.
Okay, so now we get a sense of where this idea might come from, that it is a biblical prohibition to, this doesn't say marry, this says have sex with a non-Jewish, Aramean means non-Jewish, with a non-Jewish woman. This source says that it is about giving your seed over to Molech, which remember is one of the prohibitions in Leviticus. So it is interpreted by Rabbi Ishmael to mean that's about intercourse with a non-Jew, because if you do that, you will raise up from her an enemy of God. In other words, an idolater. If you have intercourse with a non-Jewish woman, somehow it's like engaging in idolatry. Now, look at this passage in the Mishnah. Mishnah is a really important book in Judaism. Marcia, I'd like you to read this too. This is really crazy. I find this fascinating. Look at what the Mishnah says in Megillah 4:9.
Okay, one who translates, do not give from your seed to pass over to Molech, as do not give from your seed to impregnate an Aramean woman, is harshly silenced.
Okay, Marcia, take a moment, think about this source. Why is this source fascinating?
Well, impregnation is different than just having sex.
Let me help you a little bit.
Sure.
We just read from Midrash Tanaim the explanation of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael says, when the Torah says don't give your seed to Molech, it means don't have intercourse with a non-Jew. Then the Mishnah says, If you translate don't give your seed to Molech as don't have sex with a non-Jew, mishatkino to b'nezifa, we shut your mouth. So now let me ask you, what makes this source really interesting?
Well, he's talking about harshly silenced. Before he was talking about she makes an enemy of God, an idolater.
Yes. Right?
So I'm not sure how to draw that together, but I know that's the essence of it.
But that's exactly the point. You did figure it out because you're saying, I don't know how to draw them together. Exactly. These sources are completely contradictory to each other. Not just that, the Mishnah knows about Rabbi Yishmael's translation. Remember, folks, whenever the Torah was read in the old days, it was read and then the Targum was read. What is the Targum? The Aramaic translation. So let me go over with you what it says in the Hebrew. For those of you who know Hebrew, so it's a little bit clearer. Ha'omer mizaracha lo titen lehavir lamolech. So here's the Torah reader, and he's reading that passage from Leviticus. Mizaracha lo titen lehavir lamolech. Do not give your seed to pass over to Molech. Then there is another guy who's there next to the Torah reading table, and it's his job, because these were the days before we had the Hertz Chumash or the Eitz Chaim Chumash for people to follow. So the way they did it is there was a guy who would translate it into Aramaic. But sometimes, as all of you know, there's no such thing as translation without some interpretation. You always need to interpret a little bit when you're translating from one language to another. So how did this translator, once upon a time there was a shul where the translator knew about Rabbi Yishmael's understanding of that verse. And the translator said, Umizaracha lo titen le'avra be'armayutta. That's Aramaic, folks. You can hear it. Avra ba'armiyutta. So the Aramaic translator says, okay, everybody, that verse that the Torah reader just read, it means don't have sex with non-Jews. But the Mishnah says, if that's what the translator says, mishatkino to b'nezifa. You do whatever it takes to shut up that translator. During the early rabbinic period, it means there was some kind of a debate between the school of Rabbi Yishmael and some other anonymous rabbis. The school of Rabbi Yishmael believed that intercourse with a non-Jew was a biblical prohibition stemming from don't give your seed over to Molech. This, folks, is very historically plausible, given that we saw the same thing in the book of Jubilees, which is a book that originates from the Second Temple period. So we know there was a very early idea that giving your seed over to Molech meant having sex with non-Jews, and that it was on the list of biblical prohibitions, very serious prohibitions. But the Mishnah, which is an authoritative source, a really important source, says that is not what giving your seed over to Molech means. You may not translate that verse according to the book of Jubilees / Rabbi Yishmael's understanding. You may not. Now, why? I don't know. I don't know. But I invite you to think why. I invite you to think why that might be the case. Why is it that the rabbis in the Mishnah rejected the interpretation of Rabbi Yishmael. And remember, by rejecting that interpretation, they are also saying that intercourse with a non-Jew is not prohibited in the Torah.
Question.
Yes, go ahead.
Could this be interpreted, maybe I'm way off base here, to be saying that you can't have sex with a molech, with a non-Jew? However, you can have sex with someone who isn't Jewish as long as you don't impregnate them.
Well,
Because
because
that's
the verse in the Torah says, Umizar'acha lo titein, your seed shall not pass over to Molech, right? So we see that it's about this impregnation, which is my translation, right? It also says in the Aramaic, Umizar'acha lo titein. I don't think one should translate it as impregnate. It is about sex.
It's more the sex. Okay.
Yeah. It's not like they were using condoms in the in the rabbinic period, right? It's talking about intercourse. It's saying you cannot, the Mishnah is saying one should not interpret that verse as prohibiting sex with non-Jews, versus the Midrash, which says, Rabbi Yishmael says you should. Now look at what I've introduced, folks, just in these two small passages. I thought, according to what Naomi read, it was very clear that if you have intercourse with a Gentile, here it's in the context of marriage, but even if it's outside the context of marriage, that it's a prohibition. But here, with these two passages that Marcia read, we can see it's not so clear what is biblical and what is not. And that actually, in the rabbinic tradition, according to the Mishnah, there was a rejection of perhaps an earlier idea that said that intercourse with a non-Jew may have been biblical, may be a biblical prohibition. The rabbis reject it in the Mishnah. I'm showing you the evolution of the laws, which come often from conflicting, contradictory, arguing, oppositional sources. Here is oppositional source number one, but it's only 10:26, so we have time for oppositional source number two. This deals with the question of scope. When it says do not marry them, are we talking about just non-Jews from the 7 Canaanite nations, or are we speaking perhaps of all non-Jews? Help me out, Abe. Abe, could you unmute your microphone and read for me from Maimonides? I'm going to interrupt you frequently, okay? Don't be upset.
If a Jew has relations with a Gentile idolater of one of the other nations in the context of marriage, it violates a biblical prohibition. As it says, do not marry them, do not give your daughters to his son, nor take his daughter for your son. This
Okay,
law
stop
applies
there,
to the 7
stop there. So Maimonides says, in the context of marriage, you have violated a biblical prohibition. So Maimonides seems to understand lo titchatein bam, what we saw in Deuteronomy, those 3 words in Deuteronomy, as not just applying to the 7 nations, but applying to all non-Jews. And he makes it explicit here. Go ahead, Abe. This law
applies to the 7 nations of Canaan, as well as to all other nations.
So Maimonides is aware that there's an argument about whether this applies to just the 7 or to all other nations. And he says, nope, it applies to everybody. Lo titchatein bam is a biblical prohibition applying to all non-Jews. And he adds another passage that we reviewed a few weeks ago from the book of Ezra. Go ahead, Abe.
And this is explicit in Ezra. we will not give our daughters to the nations of the land, nor shall we take their daughters to our sons.
Aha. So remember that in the book of Ezra, there's a covenant that is made in the community. We won't give our daughters to the nations. We won't take their daughters for our sons. So according to Maimonides, Ezra was just picking up an idea that was already found in the Torah. One may not intermarry with any non-Jew. Seems very simple, right?
Right.
Clear, unambiguous, but it is not. Take a look at the Tur. The Tur is Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, 14th century. He wrote a very famous compilation of Jewish laws called the Arba Turim, the four pillars, and he's got a different opinion. Go ahead, Abe.
A Gentile woman, even though she is not forbidden by the Torah, is forbidden on rabbinic authority.
Interesting. So he says, no, the Bible was only talking about the 7 Canaanite nations when it said, Velo titchatein bam. Non-Jews are only forbidden to Jews on rabbinic authority. Now, he lived after Maimonides, after the Rambam, so he's going to quote the Rambam here and say, and the Rambam is wrong. Go ahead, Abe.
Rambam wrote, if a Jew has relations with a Gentile idolater of one of the other nations in the context of marriage, he violates a biblical prohibition, as it says, do not marry them, do not give your daughters to his sons, nor take his daughters for your son. This law applies to the 7 nations of Canaan as well as to the other nations.
So that is the quote. I'm sorry, it's not clear, but that is the Tur quoting the Rambam. So the Tur says it's a rabbinic violation. It is not a biblical violation. And folks, remember, that's very important because rabbinic violations or rabbinic level prohibitions, they offer much more flexibility, not total flexibility, obviously, but there's much more flexibility in changing those or adapting those or reinterpreting those versus a biblical level prohibition where the flexibility is very, very limited. So the Tur starts off saying it's rabbinic, it's not biblical, and I know that Maimonides disagrees with me. I know that Maimonides says it's biblical. When it says Velo titchatein bam, it applies to all other nations. But it seems to me, go ahead, Abe.
But it seems to me that this only applies to the 7 nations, for we do not follow Rabbi Shimon, who says, for he will cause your son to go astray. This includes all those who lead you astray.
So I'm not going to take you back. I would torture you to take you back to the passage from the Talmud that we learned last week. So I'm not going to do that, where Rabbi Shimon's view was mentioned. But Rabbi Shimon was one of the rabbis in the Talmud who said it is not just the 7 nations. The prohibition applies to everybody. The Tur says we do not follow the view of Rabbi Shimon. We follow the other view, which says that the biblical prohibition only involves the 7 nations. Notice, folks, the ambiguity I am trying to throw at you. What seems to be clear in the Shulchan Aruch, and maybe perhaps to you even in the Torah, in the Middle Ages is not so clear. The rabbis are still fighting about what's rabbinic and what's biblical. And to even make the ambiguity worse, Maimonides himself seems to suggest other things that contradict what he said earlier in different books, which is, by the way, not very surprising for Maimonides. One of the fun things we can do when you study Maimonides is see where he contradicts himself in the different books that he read and to try and smooth over those contradictions. So here's Maimonides. Remember, we already learned Maimonides. He's the one who said it's all biblical. But look what he says here in his Sefer HaMitzvot. In his book, Sefer HaMitzvot, he goes through all of the 613 mitzvot and says, this is what number 1 is, this is what number 2 is. So this is number 52. What is the negative commandment number 52 according to Maimonides? Go ahead, Abe. Actually, Abe, let me
The
get
fifth-
somebody else. No, you're a wonderful, wonderful reader, but I want to keep
Thank
the variety going. Can I ask Shirley Ann? Can I ask you to read for me the 52nd law here?
The 52nd commandment is the prohibition to marry those who negate fundamental beliefs. And this is what God meant when saying, do not marry them.
Oh, so look at this, folks. Maimonides, who just 1 page ago said, let me get my highlighter here. I want to get my highlighter function. Who says, do not marry them, means the 7 nations of Canaan as well as all other nations, right? We just reviewed this, and he wrote that in his book called Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah is his compendium of Jewish law. In his Sefer HaMitzvot, he says something else. He says the commandment, lo titchaten bam, do not marry them. It doesn't apply to the 7 nations and all non-Jews. Who does it apply to? Shirley Ann, read this one more time. What I'm highlighting?
Those who negate fundamental beliefs.
He does not use the word goyim here. He doesn't say the prohibition is marrying non-Jews. The prohibition is kofrim in Hebrew. Who are kofrim? Well, we can talk about that, right? That's a big question. What is a kofar? Is that just idolaters? Is that Christians? Are Christians kofrim? Are Muslims kofrim? Are Jews kofrim? Can Jews who are rebellious, who don't observe the commandments, are they kofrim? I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you folks, but I didn't write these things. I'm just showing you within the library of Maimonides, we have passages that seem to disagree with each other about what the prohibition against intermarriage really consists of, the biblical prohibition against intermarriage. It is not clear that he understood that prohibition to apply to all non-Jews. Here he says kofrim. So, Shirley Ann, could you also read the Ra'avad for me? The Ra'avad is the one who often argues with Maimonides, Rabbi Avraham ibn Daud. And he comments on Maimonides and often argues with him. What does he say? Shirley Ann, could you go ahead? Just as the oil? Oh, I'm sorry. I need to unmute you. Thanks, Shirley Ann. Okay.
Just as the oil of a ger toshav is forbidden to eat, but one may benefit from it, so too with his wine.
Okay, stop there. The oil of a ger toshav is forbidden to eat, but one may benefit from it, also with his wine. Now, who is a ger toshav? We could also have a long conversation about that, about what a ger toshav is. But let me give you the abbreviated version. A ger toshav is a non-Jew who comes over to the Jewish outlook in some ideological, theological, practical way. It means resident stranger, but there was no resident stranger in the Middle Ages, right? So the ger toshav here, as the Ra'avad understands it, is a non-Jew who, let's say, accepts the 7 Noahide laws. He didn't convert, or she didn't convert, still not Jewish, but she accepts Judaism. She likes Judaism. She's part of the Jewish people. She's a resident among the Jews. So when it comes to her oil and her wine, the ruling in Jewish law is we're a bit more lenient because this person we know is not practicing idolatry. Remember, the big concerns with regards to oil and wine that are not kosher is that that oil or that wine may have been used in idolatry. But if it was produced by a ger toshav, we know that that ger toshav does not practice idolatry. Now, we still have some prohibition with it. We're not allowed to eat the oil or the wine, but we can benefit from it. I can sell it, which is a lesser level prohibition. Now, why is that the case? Shirley Ann, go ahead.
We have no concern that the ger toshav will offer an idolatrous libation. And if we are afraid a Gentile might have touched it, that sort of doubt is not sufficient to forbid benefiting from the wine.
So there you have the Ra'avad's justification. We're not as worried about a ger toshav. We're a little bit worried because it's true that a Gentile might have taken the wine and used it to pour on their idol. Okay, because a ger toshav wouldn't be as careful as a Jew. But that's not enough of a doubt, not sufficient a doubt to prevent us from benefiting from the wine. Okay, now here's where he says something else that's interesting. Go ahead, Shirley Ann.
Nonetheless, it is forbidden to drink it on account of the possibility that a Gentile touched it or for fear of intermarriage, because the ger toshav is nonetheless covered by the ban of do not marry them.
So the Ra'avad here disagrees with the Rambam, right? Or may disagree with the Rambam, depending on definitions. According to the Ra'avad, do not marry them. When the Torah says do not marry them, it means all non-Jews, even a ger toshav, even a friendly non-Jew. Versus Maimonides, who says here that actually it only applies to kofrim, those who negate fundamental beliefs. And finally, Shirley Ann, can you read the Minchat Chinuch?
It seems that with respect to the biblical prohibition on intermarriage, a ger toshav is included as well.
So according to the Minchat Chinuch and the Ra'avad, they both agree. The biblical ban on intermarriage, it covers everybody. That differs from the opinion of the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvot, and also the opinion of the Tur in the Arba Turim. The Tur says it's not biblical, it is rabbinic. Now, just to remind you all, what I'm trying to do by throwing these sources at you is to complicate the clarity in this discussion. What might appear to be very logical to you, which is when the Torah says "V'lo titchaten bam," it means you can't marry non-Jews. If you wanted to say to me, no, it does not, and argue with the accepted interpretation in the Shulchan Aruch, you would not be outside the boundaries of normative Judaism. Because even the Tur says it's rabbinic. Even Maimonides in the Sefer HaMitzvot says it applies to kofrim. It applies to those who negate fundamental beliefs, but perhaps not friendly Jews, perhaps not ger toshav. And that's really what I want to do in this second part of the class, is to show you, to me, the very beautiful multivocality of Torah that leads sometimes to false clarity when you read things like the Shulchan Aruch, and it all seems so clear and conclusive, that the discussion on this from the Jewish perspective is actually much richer. And what we call biblical and what we call rabbinic is of crucial importance. Because one might, I know already some of your heads are churning and saying, well, who is a ger toshav today? Who is a ger toshav today? If a ger toshav is not included in the biblical prohibition against intermarriage, and there's room to accept a ger toshav. Look, Rose, you jumped already on the question. I see it in the comment box. Is an atheist, but an ethical atheist, there's different kinds of atheists, right? An atheist who says, and we all know people like this, they say, I don't believe in God, but I believe in morality. I believe in the importance of being kind, in the importance of being a good person. That's a very popular belief out there today. Is that a ger toshav that perhaps the Bible leaves room for, or the Torah leaves room for, in the scope of, in the space of delineating the limits on intermarriage? And if a person came up to you and said, I actually think Jewish law makes a distinction between what kind of non-Jew am I marrying, maybe it's not fair for us to say that's nonsense. It says all non-Jews are the same. I'm complicating that with these sources and saying, do you know, even 1,000 years ago, the rabbis said not all non-Jews are the same. There's idolaters. There's kofrim. There are deniers of fundamental aspects of Judaism. There are ger toshav, those who find themselves to be welcome within the Jewish fold, but for one reason or another have not converted. Don't say to me, that's a modern discussion. You're confusing all of this because of modernity. Oh, yeah? Well, now you have a 14th century text to show such a person and say, this ain't so modern. Even back then, they believed that there are distinctions that ought to be made. And I have more distinctions to show you next week, but I believe I've given you enough to think about this week to get to where I'm taking you.